Mastering Close Quarters Combat, Essential Primer for Your Successful Fighting. Introduction. What is it? If you have ever studied martial arts or real combat art, that is, you know that you spend at least 1/3 of your training time in close quarter combat. Every natural, real-world warrior must understand the necessity of having these skill sets to prevail in a fight. But wait, there are 3 areas of unarmed combat. Long-distance fighting, at the very end of the reach of your arms or feet. Next, you are touching each other up close, and with or without your eyes, you are able to see your opponent's moves, weight shifts, or base movement. The next area is on the ground, where you can't expect to use your eyes in your defense at all. A person's self-defense is defined by distance from the person to the attacker. On the broadest scale, this is from one ballistic missile or strategic military platform to your location. In the beginning, we had our hands, then perhaps rocks, and then a spear. The spears were much like today's ballistic nuclear missiles in that they gave you standoff range to your opponent. Today, we might think of anti-personnel missiles like drones as digital spears. Later, there was the outlaw, which used leverage to achieve greater velocity than a spear or a dart. Greater velocity equates to harder hitting and more kinetic energy being delivered to the target, thus creating more damage. Next were bows and arrows, and I'm sure you are getting the point. In some cases, weapons were brought right into close quarters combat, like the knife, axe, samurai sword, and other medieval bladed weapons. So, it comes down to distance in many ways of thinking, with the minor caveat that some other weapons are brought into a ground fight, for example. Thus, knowledge and skill sets for dealing with those types of weapons are very important for surviving a close quarters combat experience. For this blog post, we will cover empty-handed close quarter combat, and in future blog posts, we will add weapons to this foundation. I, Master Peter Brusso, want to cover one of the most critical aspects of close quarters combat that isn't addressed by most others, and that is one of brain neurology. 3 types of neurology. One day in the dojo, I was doing a basic punching drill for the class. I was focusing on some fundamental concepts in a simple yet overlooked front punch we all knew about since we used one of those air-filled children's punching bags in our bedrooms. Well, or at least I did and can admit that. You punch at the bag, which has various faces on the bag for fun, and it rotates down to the ground from your punch but then comes rushing back up at you. Now what? Well, you learn to punch at it again, but harder, if that was possible. It did develop hand/eye coordination, movement, and follow-up techniques. It was a good thing to learn to fight without knowing what it was doing. Now, back to the dojo, school, drill, I was showing how you punch with your front hand fist and take the weight off your front foot just before contacting the target. This places a component of your body weight into the punch. This punch wasn't just the power you generate with your muscles and speed, but it also had another force added to it. If you didn't put your foot back down on the ground, you would fall forward onto the ground. Thus, you are putting a force into the punch that is connected to your body movement or a 2-point contact. Your rear foot and front hand are the only things holding you up from falling at the time of contact with the target. Now, there was one PhD person in the back row. A very smart man. His punch didn't look like what we were performing. He would use his rear hand to punch, for one thing, in contrast to us using our front hand. He was also doing some wind-up hand movements, much like you might see in cartoons. Something was truly amiss here. So, I turned the class over to another instructor and went to work with the PhD. I wanted to see if I could understand his behavior in this training sequence, and it was a simple one at that. I talked him through it in parts. I showed him the punch. Then, the step is followed by the extension but not extending or locking out your elbow. I did all these things slowly. He followed each part of what I showed him. Giving him a verbal command to punch or put these things together generated an even more messed up performance. How is that possible? I thought. I have been training since I was 6 years old. As of this month, I will be 71 years old. I never saw an issue like this before, and that was when I was in my late 40s. However, something came to mind that I had been taught many years back. I remembered how people learn to perform anything in life. There are 5 levels of how they do that. Here, for simplicity, we will keep it to 3 levels, but you will see it right away. Then, I will map that into close quarters combat, at which point, there will be many things made very clear to you. You have been subject to these things without really knowing it, and when you hear this, you will do one of those, hitting your head with your hand, an AHA moment. I guarantee it unless you have been one of my students. Visual, kinesthetic, and auditory learners. Visual learners learn by watching, kinesthetic learners learn by sense of feel, and auditory learners learn by sound. You have heard people say things like, "That looks right to me, I feel good about this path, and this sounds good to me." Yes, they have been telling us what their primary sense of learning or neurology they use. So, back to that PhD older student. He was a mix of two of these neurologies. Specifically, he had 70% kinesthetic and 30% auditory neurology working and no visual at all. Now, I'm a mix of visual and kinesthetic learners, so I reached over and grabbed his arms, physically moved his feet, and told him how it should feel to move or glide into the punch, slightly losing contact with the floor at the moment of target contact. I had him hold onto the lapel of his GI, or martial arts uniform, with his right hand, as this was a left-hand front punch we were attempting to perform. Now, the PhD lessons have become more fruitful once I have done two things. First, I needed to teach in his neurology, and second, he needed to start learning in his neural style. Dummy me. Well, that front punch, he got really good at that technique. So much so that he almost knocked out a training partner with it about 4 weeks after this wonderful learning event. Later that month, I visited 2 other martial arts schools and saw it again. The entire school or fighting system was for those who liked to fight far away. That is a long distance, and they hated to fight close quarters or on the ground. At another school, they specialized in taking opponents to the ground and fighting them there. These were kinesthetic warriors who hated to fight far away. Most of their opponents in real life would be visual learners and hate to be without their eyesight. Or, to translate that, they hate to be on the ground fighting. There was again, learning styles popping up in the martial arts world, and strangely enough, I taught the mental side of the golf game. The learning styles are there, too. We must embrace this finding if we are going to teach close-quarter combat to visuals or neurological mixes. So, I coined a phrase about teaching warriors, far field, up close, and on the ground. These are the 3 areas warriors need to fight within, and each neurology thrives in one of these 3 fighting worlds. So, to be a well-rounded fighter, you need stand-up or far-field fighting, up close in the grapple, and ground fighting skills. Few total martial arts systems address these 3 various areas, but I know of a few. Most schools specialize in one of these 3 areas and, in most cases, acknowledge the others but don't teach you many skill sets in those areas. So, if you are a person who wants to conquer all 3 areas, you need to find one school or system that does that or go to various systems to gain your warrior skills. Weapons in the mix. I said I was going to stay in the empty-hand world of close-quarter combat, but I want to spend just a few moments giving the reader some important things to think about. There are 2 essential things that you must understand about close-quarters combat. Most of the time, it will involve some weapon. The traditional ones are a firearm or knife. There are others called weapons of opportunity. You must understand a few basic things about these unarmed close-quarters combat martial arts add-ons in your fight. How to disarm the weapon. There is something called the universal law of escapes. It has nothing to do with how powerful you are or pushing against the thumb, as some are taught. Those are power techniques. In battle, you might not be very powerful for a number of reasons, so learning a system based on power isn't that smart. Instead, it is about angles, anatomy, and leverage. The scope of this blog doesn't allow me to get much into this. However, if readers are interested, I can write one, that is for sure. The power of this way of thinking is that you only need to learn one technique. Yep, just one technique. The cool thing about it is that this technique applies to weapon disarms as well. Yep, just one technique. How to use a weapon. There is a misconception about weapons. We think we all know how to use a gun or a knife. The truth is that we don't. It would be best if you learned how to remove the safety from a weapon to load or reseat an ammunition magazine so it will feed rounds into the weapon. Do you understand tap, slap, and rack and use that after a disarm? Do you know the difference between the environment of a rotary gun and an automatic one? Do you know how to use a knife? You might think you do, but can you tell me the difference between stabbing a solid blood organ, an artery, or a vein? Do you know where to find them? These skill sets are critical for you to survive a close quarters combat situation. It means two things to a warrior. First, how fast are they going to be dead? How fast is it until they are no longer a threat? These two things are very different. In one case, when can you expect them not to be functional at much of a level? The second is when they will never be a threat. For example, if you stab your opponent in the kidney, how long until they are in shock? How long before their blood pressure drops to the point their body isn't functional any longer? Or they have a gun but can't pull the trigger. They can't reach out and stab at you or swing a machete. How long is that? How long before they succumb to their stab or cut injury from you? It is essential to know the results of your attacks in close quarter combat. So, what do you study for close quarters combat? A striking and punching art. The first area of close quarters combat is movement, punching, and kicking. If you can focus on taking the opponent's base away, that is one of the primary strategies. For example, if you break their legs or knees, they can't stand up to fight you empty-handed. So, destabilizing the opponent is a primary goal in close quarters combat. These skills can come from most combat-oriented martial arts, but not a sport art. In sport art, you cannot or are not allowed to kick the knees, ankles, testicles, or the like. Footing and movement are also involved in that same strategy. In sports art, you are always indoors, on a well-defined fighting surface. This is the best condition to fight on. There are no slopes, hills, or ponds of water. However, if you are fighting on a slope, it is best to fight downhill if you are armed with projectile weapons. This is just the opposite of empty-handed fighting. If you have knives, then it is better to fight uphill. If both of you have knives, you can cut away at the base of the opponent, and all he can ultimately do is throw his knife at you. If your opponent can be maneuvered so they are uphill, all they can do is kick at you. You, on the other hand, can block and punch or grapple with their legs. That grapple can lead to broken knees or ankles. You have more strategy and weapons to bring into the fight if you are fighting uphill. Their punches cannot reach you, and they can be off balance trying to kick you. Ultimately, the uphill battle will allow you to pull them down the hill and perhaps use other environmental features or opportunities that can lead to your opponent's demise. Stand-up grappling art. A close quarters combat art that focuses on grapple and counter-grapple is the next thing to study. This can be Jiu-Jitsu, Ninjutsu, or even Judo. Let's look at the less obvious one of Judo. Enter Judo. The history of Judo is rooted in the Japanese samurai, who needed some martial skills if their weapons got broken, smashed, or rendered useless. Armed warriors surrounded them, so what could a warrior do other than die or run? Enter the art of Judo. It is claimed to be a gentle art, but it is anything other than gentle on the battlefield. Basically, you close the distance, grab or grapple with the opponent to off-balance them, or throw them onto the ground. Now, throwing them onto the ground part sounds gentlemanly or is a part of some honor code in Judo, but it isn't. The design of the throws was, 1. You throw them, so they land on their neck, and the force of their body breaks their neck. This is the permanent end of round 1 of the empty-handed Judo fight. Or 2. You go down to the ground and choke them to death. One of 2 chokes is used to attain judoka's goal, but that is out of the scope of this blog post. The art of Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu is an excellent art that requires skill sets. Not only does it have counter-grapple escape techniques, but it also has to grapple ways to cripple the opponent. A broken body can't form a sizable physical threat to you. When arms, wrists, elbows, legs, knees, or ankles don't function well, they are done as a combatant. Projectile weapons might not follow this rule as much, but almost everything else does. This art also has throws or transitions to ground fighting plus chokes to the death. It also comes in 2 flavors, sport and combat, so you know which one to ask for when you are going to study their art. Enter the ninja. I must admit I am prone to ninjutsu as I have studied it since 1982, and it does bring all these worlds together. But I will overlook that to mention they have close quarters combat down to a fine art. They are no sports art, so they close the distance to kill you. They study that all the time, so their techniques have been proven on the battlefield for over the last 1,500 years. Now, as long-distance fighters, they use weapons and not their hands or feet. However, when they do, there is no other art on the planet that uses what they do. To that end, it has many advantages over any other art. On the ground fighting, MMA fighters have become more or less an excellent overall model for close quarters combat. The only thing I would say is they can't strike the eyes, throat, or groin. They are hunting for a knockout or a submission on the ground. Neither of these is highly valued on the battlefield. Also, being on the ground should be emulating a frog in a frying pan. You want to get the job done and get the heck off the ground because of the multiple attackers on a battlefield. It is the multiple attackers that change the equation between law enforcement and military encounters. There are a few exceptions in each, but you don't see multiple attackers in MMA. If I get on the ground, I try to kill or maim as fast as I can, then get up. I don't mind being on the ground, and in some situations, you want to stay there and not be shot by the enemy. But, as far as more combatants come to get you, most times, it's best to get back up into the fight. I have studied techniques used by multiple attackers on the ground, so those do exist. However, it does depend on the situation. Conclusion: the art of close quarters combat is an absolute necessity for any serious martial artist or self-defense enthusiast. As we've learned, you're not just teaching techniques, you're teaching the differences of ranges, your learning style, and how you will survive on the battlefield. Key takeaways. 1. There are 3 areas to be considered: far field, up close, and on the ground. 2. Finding your neurological learning style, visual, kinesthetic, auditory, is significant for training and usage. 3. The fighter that has an edge will require knowledge of far field combat, close quarters, and ground fighting, in addition to using your environment to your advantage. 4. Weapons awareness and disarming are integral aspects of close combat training. 5. Martial arts provide different strengths in ground combat, from striking arts to grappling systems such as Judo and Jiu-Jitsu. 6. Combat situations on the battlefield or street can sometimes be different from competitive MMA in terms of multiple threats and rapid, decisive responses. Always remember that proficiency in close combat is only achieved with time and practice. It would be best if you learned far field, up close, and ground techniques tailored to realistic combat situations. From martial arts gurus to novices, your route to becoming a master of close combat is continuous and developing. In training, always focus on the efficient, everyday exercises that work with your personal learning style and physical limitations. Stay informed, stay prepared, and most importantly, stay safe.